Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take complex narratives throughout the noise and look for the pure strategic metal underneath. Today, we are strapping on the cold, hard, philosophical armor of Niccolo Machiavelli. We're going to analyze a legal conflict that, on the surface, looked like simple celebrity or, political drama. But underneath, it was a textbook example of power dissolving itself through a tactical, catastrophic blender.
That's absolutely right. We're moving far beyond the daily headlines. Those often treat these events as just, gossip or something that will blow over. Our goal today is to view this specific confrontation involving the author Michael Wolff, Melania Trump, and, well, by extension, Donald Trump, not as a contemporary scandal, but as a timeless warning, a warning about the fragility of authority.
So the big question is, what happens when modern political power makes an ancient mistake?
Exactly. It's a study in how control just collapses the very moment a ruler or their inner circle forgets restraint and tries to silence a knowledgeable insider.
Yeah.
And does it clumsily.
And our source material for this is rich. We've got excerpts and detailed analysis that really dig into the escalating conflict between Michael Wolff and the Trumps. The focus is specifically on that erosion of control that happened right after the first legal threats were made.
And it's dense. Not with rumor, but with, real strategic insight into how power fights back when it's been cornered.
Okay, so our mission here, for you, the listener, what are we trying to pull out of this?
It's twofold. First, we want to extract the insights about who actually controls the narrative when the legal system, which we're going to call the engine or the machine, gets turned on. And second, we need to understand why Michael Wolff's specific and frankly aggressive counteractions show a shockingly successful power strategy. He didn't just survive the threat, he actually weaponized it.
Okay, let's unpack this. We have to start at the beginning. With that initial move that set this whole chain reaction off, we're calling it the anatomy of a strategic miscalculation. So the first move, the attempt to shut Michael Wolff down. At the time, this looked pretty standard, right? A powerful figure issues a threat, demands a retraction, an apology, threatens huge financial penalties. But Machiavelli, if he were watching, he would look at that and say, hold on, that's not strength.
No, not at all. He'd say that is power revealing its anxiety.
Right.
Precisely. Machiavelli's central warning to any ruler is that weakness isn't exposed when your enemies attack you. Weakness is exposed when the ruler overreacts, when they show a lack of proportion. So in this case, Michael Wolff's claims, which were based on his access as a biographer, they clearly touched on some very sensitive subjects.
And the moment Melania Trump, through her lawyers, demanded that retraction and apology, what signal did that send?
It sent a signal that was far louder than she intended. It signaled vulnerability, and critically, it signaled fear.
That's a huge distinction. So you're saying it's not about the claims themselves, but about the fact that they felt they had to respond so publicly.
Exactly. In Machiavellian terms, threats are never neutral. They are signals. They tell your opponent what you care about. By reacting so forcefully, they basically announce that this content mattered deeply, maybe too deeply. I mean, if Wolff's statements were really baseless or just politically insignificant, the smart strategic move is what?
Silence. You ignore it. Let the news cycle bury it.
You let it fade.
Yeah.
But by issuing that demand and threatening these, astronomical, crippling damages in the millions, they announced to the world that Michael Wolff had hit a nerve that required this immediate, aggressive, but ultimately incomplete action.
And we really have to establish who Michael Wolff is here. This is crucial. He wasn't just some random commentator.
Not at all.
He was Donald Trump's former biographer, an individual who had spent years inside their world with access to allies, enemies, staff. He knew the geography.
And that background is the foundation of his unique danger. Machiavelli taught that a ruler should fear no one more than the insider who falls out of favor. A random critic can be dismissed. Oh, they're biased or they're uninformed. But you can't do that with an insider. An insider is dangerous not because they might invent a story, but because of what they already know.
The reservoir of verifiable material.
Yes. Michael Wolff has what we call archival power. It's the strategic leverage that comes from years of observation, documented interviews, access. The legal threat just confirmed, both to the public and to Wolff himself, that his archival power wasn't just descriptive, it was politically potent. It was destabilizing.
So the initial move didn't just fail. It actually validated the opponent and signaled the ruler's own weakness. Which brings us to what the sources call the critical error, the fatal law that was violated.
This is maybe the most fundamental Machiavellian law there is, whether it's for military or legal force. Never force an enemy into a corner unless you are prepared for total war. When Melania Trump threatened this overwhelming legal action. She initiated a hostile engagement. She drew her sword, but then she didn't commit to the battle.
And what was the consequence of that? I mean, it seems like just a tactical retreat, but you're framing it as a total catastrophe.
It was strategically devastating for their authority, because by threatening those massive damages but then failing to actually file the lawsuit, what did that do? It revealed the threat to be a colossal bluff.
Right.
Machiavelli warned about this. A ruler's authority is weakened more by threats you don't follow through on than by just staying silent. They transformed themselves from a protected figure into a vulnerable target. They proved they could be provoked, and then they proved they would retreat. That set a precedent.
I have to push back a bit, though. I mean, don't lawyers send these kinds of strong warning letters all the time just to deter behavior without having to actually go to court?
They do, and it could be seen that way if the target was, say, a small blog or a first-time commentator. But you have to factor in the quality of the opponent here. This wasn't some minor skirmish. This was a highly public demand aimed at an established biographer who was extremely confident in his information. For a political figure at this level, the bar for successful intimidation is much, much higher.
And when the target is someone like Michael Wolff, who is informed and aggressive.
And has a political message to sell, yeah. Leveraging the threat without executing just validates his resolve. I mean, think about the cost benefit. The cost for Wolff to comply, a retraction, an apology, was huge for his reputation. But the actual cost of resisting, an unfiled lawsuit, turned out to be zero. That imbalance is what empowered him.
So the authority they were trying to protect became vulnerable simply because the threat was made, but the battle was abandoned. It essentially proved their sensitivity and gave him the strategic and moral high ground to escalate.
Exactly. It's the classic error. Confusing intimidation with strategy. Intimidation only works if the cost of resistance feels immediate and absolute. When you fail to follow through, you're left exposed, and your target is now free to redefine the entire conflict on his own terms.
And here's where the whole narrative just completely flips. We have to shift focus to the really aggressive brilliance of Michael Wolff's response. He didn't just sit back. He didn't wait for a lawsuit that was never coming. He made a decisive and frankly shocking countermove. He filed his own lawsuit.
Alleging the threat was an attempt to chill his constitutional rights.
Which is just a total reversal.
It's the core strategic action, and it shows this ruthless understanding of a core Machiavellian principle. Power belongs to whoever controls the battlefield. The moment Michael Wolff filed that suit, he legally and politically became the aggressor. He was no longer a defendant who had to defend his speech. He was now a plaintiff demanding transparency for what he claimed was an attempt to silence him.
That distinction is so critical. He didn't just defend, he weaponized the court system against the person who threatened him first. The source material calls lawsuits in this context weapons of exposure.
And that is the most accurate way to frame it. I mean, we often think of lawsuits as, settling disputes or getting money. But strategically, especially against powerful political figures who thrive on secrecy, lawsuits are instruments of forced revelation. The discovery phase. It's not about PR spin. It's about forced truth. It's a legal mechanism that just rips away all the protective layers.
So let's detail that mechanism, because this is what makes it the nightmare scenario for any powerful figure trying to control a narrative. By becoming the plaintiff, what can Michael Wolff now legally compel them to do?
He gains the power of state-sanctioned compulsion. We have to understand this. He can issue subpoenas to anyone he deems relevant. He can demand documents, emails, texts, internal memos, and most importantly, he can demand depositions.
Which are questions under oath.
Under oath, with a court reporter, where every word matters. These aren't just interviews. They're binding legal traps designed to enforce consistency and reveal contradictions. For the Trumps, who rely completely on controlling the story, the idea of answering pointed questions under penalty of perjury, it's strategically catastrophic.
I wonder, though, what was the risk for Wolff here? I mean, he is opening himself up to being deposed, having his own sources questioned. Wasn't that a gamble?
It was, but it was a calculated one. And that's the brilliance of it. His information was already out there in his book. His countersuit was very narrowly focused on one thing, the intimidation. He wasn't trying to relitigate every claim in his writing. He was forcing the fight to be about their intent and their actions in setting that threat. He was confident in the paper trail of the threat itself. And he was betting his archival power was stronger than whatever they had. His risk was high, but the potential payoff forcing them into the light was so much higher.
And what makes this so dangerous is that the trap didn't stop with Melania Trump, who is the named target. Once he starts discovery, the process inevitably leads to Donald Trump.
Inevitably. The court system operates on relevance. not on political boundaries or spousal privilege. Once discovery starts, the scope naturally expands. The court needs to know, who was consulted about this threat? Did Donald Trump know about the letter before it was sent? Were family or political resources used? Suddenly, the person who was meant to be protected is now an unavoidable potential witness.
And this connects directly to you, our listener. This shows how an aggressive counter strategy from an informed opponent like Michael Wolff can just immediately raise the stakes for an entire inner circle. It turns a contained controversy into a structural threat that engulfs everyone.
It's the ultimate loss of control. The initial goal was containment and silence. The actual result was an exponential expansion of risk. It's an invitation for a forensic examination of their entire operation. Michael Wolff knew that the system, once he activated it, would do the heavy lifting for him. He got to the courthouse first, and by doing so, he dictated the rules of engagement.
Okay, so let's move into the third phase, the immediate reaction to Wolff's lawsuit. Once he became the hunter, sources reported that Melania Trump's legal team tried to avoid being served with the legal documents. Process servers blocked, lawyers refusing papers, this whole cat-and-mouse game.
And we have to analyze this through that cold, unforgiving Machiavellian lens. A ruler must appear confident, even when afraid. When you're a figure of that level of power, your actions aren't just legal moves, they're signals. And retreating, or appearing to run, signals guilt, regardless of the actual facts of the case.
So avoiding service, which might just be a technical delay tactic in normal litigation, becomes politically disastrous in this context.
Oh, it's absolutely devastating.
The source material calls this flight as admission, not in a strict legal sense, but in the court of public perception, which is the real battlefield here. When a high-profile figure avoids being served, the public narrative is instantly fixed. They are hiding. And the question becomes, what are they so afraid of? In the public's mind, it's not strategic, it's an admission, and fear spreads much faster than facts.
And that loss of face just accelerates everything else. They lost the psychological battle before the legal one even properly began.
Completely. The psychological cost of appearing to run is huge. It just confirms Wolff's narrative that they're trying to suppress the truth. It legitimizes his aggressive approach. And critically, that sense of fear now surrounded Donald Trump too, because Wolff had made it very clear. The discovery process would not stop at Melania Trump. It would involve the entire infrastructure.
This just confirms why Wolff is such a unique and, as the analysis calls him, a dangerous witness. Machiavelli warned rulers about insiders who speak with specificity, not just speculation. He has the maps.
That is the core of his leverage. He's not just some commentator relying on anonymous sources. He is Donald Trump's former biographer. He was in the room. He took notes. He kept records. He was navigating the palace walls for years.
You call this his archival power. What does that mean in the practical sense, like in a deposition?
It means he's not just fishing for information during discovery. He already knows where the gaps in the public story are. He knows where the potentially damaging documents might be kept. He claims he was shown specific materials, told specific stories that, if they were subjected to sworn testimony forced into the legal record, would become explosive. And the explosion isn't just about the content itself, it's that it's backed up by documentation, by detailed time-stamped recollections.
So the central tension here is that the Trumps now have to defend every single action and statement they've ever made about him, under oath.
Exactly. And that burden is massive. They have to prove everything was defamatory and their threat was legitimate. Michael Wolff, on the other hand, only needs to prove one specific thing, that their unfiled threat was made in bad faith to chill his speech. Every denial they make risks being contradicted by the records Wolff intends to compel. That's the power. He only has to puncture their story at one critical, documented point.
And the staggering consequence is that by threatening him and then retreating, she inadvertently invited this highly leveraged power into the public record under the force of the court. She traded a temporary annoyance for permanent, documented legal risk.
A monumental, unforced error. Machiavelli's primary advice was, if an accusation can't destroy you, don't dignify it with a response. By acknowledging it with a threat and then failing to execute, she not only empowered Wolff, but she validated the very information she was trying to suppress.
We've now reached what you call the second movement of this story. The initial skirmish is over, and that boundary between private maneuvering and public reckoning, it just dissolves. We have the legal system itself becoming this unstoppable, unfeeling force.
And this transition is so important to understand. Machiavelli knew that power has limits when it faces impartial institutions. He knew that courts, records, procedures, they aren't moral actors. They're engines. They are machines. Once you turn them on, they just move forward. with or without your consent.
So the fatal illusion, as the source material calls it, is believing that your political status can somehow suspend or stall that process.
That is the trap. Trying to avoid service, refusing documents, delaying. It might feel like you're being clever in the moment, but all it does is aggravate the situation in the eyes of the judge. The system eventually advances. The court will deem service complete. It will demand sanctions for evasive behavior. Avoidance becomes evasion, and evasion in a legal context invites maximum compulsion.
And compulsion leads directly to discovery. We have to really emphasize this because this is Machiavelli's greatest fear in a modern legal procedure: exposure under compulsion.
Discovery is exposure without the possibility of negotiation or consent. Machiavelli told rulers to fear legal entanglements more than open armies. Armies fight on the surface. Discovery fights underground. It pulls up the roots, not just the branches. It compels disclosure of everything.
So let's detail the sheer breadth of this, because the potential subpoena list goes way beyond just what was said between them.
The scope is staggering. We are talking about compelling all forms of communication relevant to the case. Encrypted apps, text messages, emails, financial records showing payments to lawyers, calendars, and critically, all the internal communications that happen between spouses, advisors, consultants, anyone about that initial threat and the book itself. The relevance just keeps expanding.
And that relentless pursuit of relevance, that's the direct line to Donald Trump. Even if he's not the named defendant in Wolf's suit, discovery makes him unavoidable.
Completely unavoidable as a witness. Once questions come up about the timeline, about the communication chain, about his prior knowledge, relevance just naturally encompasses him. He would be subject to a subpoena as a witness to shed light on his wife's actions, the resources used, the whole context. He gets pulled in not by a direct charge, but by the irresistible gravity of relevance in a court of law.
And what's the specific political risk of a former president submitting to a hostile deposition conducted by the lawyers of a critical former biographer? This is where high status meets the low road mechanics of the legal system.
The political risk is severe. First, the spectacle itself. It shatters the aura of invulnerability. Being forced to sit for hours under oath, facing these detailed questions from an adversary, it compromises that image instantly. Second, and more practically, anything said in that deposition will be meticulously analyzed for contradictions with past public statements. A single inconsistency, even on a minor point, can be weaponized to suggest dishonesty. You surrender control of the narrative completely.
Which highlights what the analysis calls the sin of carelessness.
The ultimate courtly sin. Machiavelli believed a ruler's inner circle has to act with discipline and cold calculation. Private errors become public disasters when the stakes are this high. By acting emotionally, demanding a retraction with that unfiled threat, Melania Trump opened a legal door that Donald Trump cannot easily close. This was impulsive.
She placed him directly in the path of sworn questioning by a former biographer, Michael Wolff, someone who knows exactly where to look.
And now has the legal right to compel the records. She turned a PR problem into a severe sworn exposure risk for the entire structure. The goal was silence. The outcome was involuntary transparency that directly implicated the most powerful person in their organization.
It's a terrifying lesson in the difference between wielding political power and controlling institutional power.
Precisely. Political power can influence institutions, but legal institutions, when activated, they operate on procedure and precedent, not on political whim. They're engines that cannot be bullied, they can only be obeyed.
Now we get into the domain of unavoidable collateral damage. The shadows that you just can't contain once that legal engine is running. The sources point specifically to unresolved associations, and the name Jeffrey Epstein immediately looms over this.
Machiavelli explicitly warned about this. Rulers have to deal decisively with unresolved associations because they can be weaponized by opponents years later. The name Epstein functions exactly that way here. Once it's raised in a legal context, even tangentially, it can widen the scope of inquiry dramatically, because the court is interested in the environment, the knowledge, the intent surrounding the alleged intimidation.
I get the political toxicity of the name, but how does Michael Wolff legally make the Epstein files relevant in a deposition about an intimidation suit?
That's the critical legal maneuver. Wolff's team would argue relevance not around the core crimes, but around the Trump state of mind, their need for privacy. They could argue, for example, did past associations like the one with Epstein make the Trumps hyper-vigilant about press coverage and therefore more likely to resort to intimidation? If they can establish that a fear of exposure was a motive behind threatening Wolff, then any documentation of high-risk associations, discussions, photos, communications related to Epstein suddenly becomes legally relevant to establishing that motive.
So we're not talking about public rumor anymore. We're talking about compelled legal fact. That's a huge difference.
A massive difference. Michael Wolff, as an insider, alleges specific conversations and photos exist. If these are raised in sworn testimony, they move out of the realm of rumor and into the realm of compelled legal fact. Even if the details aren't illegal, the mere documentation of close association under oath creates irreparable political risk. The context alone is destabilizing.
And the political damage is profound because discovery forces the ruler to defend that past publicly, involuntarily, and under oath.
That is the core strategic failure. Machiavelli warned that rulers must never allow outsiders to define their past. Discovery actively invites outsiders, Michael Wolff and his legal team, to do just that. Through specific, verifiable procedures, control is lost.
And this collateral damage doesn't stop with old associations. The sources also highlight this inevitable drift of attention toward Melania Trump's origins, what they call the immigration narrative and the erosion of legitimacy.
Machiavelli placed huge value on narrative clarity. Legitimacy flows from a simple, stable origin story. Once the legal system is activated, every public claim made about her history, her status, her professional background becomes fair game for relevance.
Why is that so dangerous from a strategic perspective? Isn't it just a distraction?
It's not a distraction, it's systemic erosion. Uncertainty erodes authority. Discovery forces a level of forensic detail that exposes every potential inconsistency, every correction, every removed professional claim she ever made. All of it. Each one of those things, when brought up in a deposition about visa status or sponsors, feeds a story of concealment. And concealment, Machiavelli knew, is fatal to public trust. Rulers must keep their stories simple and stable. Complexity invites scrutiny.
So the goal for Wolff isn't necessarily to prove a specific violation, but to force enough inconsistencies into the record that the narrative of concealment takes over.
That's precisely the aim. The erosion is incremental but total. Every time a lawyer has to issue a clarification or a document contradicts a public statement, her story becomes less clear and therefore less legitimate. All thanks to a discovery process that was accidentally activated by one careless legal threat.
And finally, inside the palace itself, there's the perception of internal relationships. Michael Wolff noted the optics of absence as a message, specifically Melania Trump avoiding public displays of solidarity at critical moments.
Machiavelli teaches that every action and every inaction is a political message. When public unity would most benefit Donald Trump, her visible absence reads as a fracture. In a Machiavellian analysis, this signals one of two dangerous things. Either it's strategic distancing, separating herself from potential liability, or there is outright internal hostility, a division in the household.
And either way, it weakens the ruler's perceived strength.
Absolutely. A ruler whose household appears divided invites speculation. Speculation invites investigation. An investigation, via discovery, invites exposure. Perception outweighs reality in politics, and the optics of a less than unified front create a vulnerability that an opponent like Wolff can easily exploit.
Okay, let's bring all this home. Let's pull together these strands of strategic failure and unintended consequence. When you look back at the whole thing, the harsh lesson is really the trap of half measures.
Absolutely. The defining failure is crystallized in that simple, brutal Machiavellian phrase. If you strike, you must destroy. If you hesitate, you empower. By threatening Wolff and then retreating, by signaling hostility without delivering resolution Melania, Trump committed the classic error of confusing bravado with commitment. She signaled her deepest anxiety while proving her ultimate lack of resolve.
And that retreat empowered Michael Wolff on every level, morally, legally, strategically.
Morally, he gained complete justification to escalate while looking like the principled one. Strategically, he took absolute control of the battlefield by defining the legal question as intimidation, not defamation. The role reversal is devastating. The Trumps appeared volatile, while Wolff appeared measured and calm, just using the system to protect his rights.
And the sources warn this vulnerability leads to the uncontainable spread. Once authority looks vulnerable, the whole ecosystem responds.
The palace walls crack, and everyone outside notices. Journalists dig deeper. Political opponents reframe the narrative. Former allies reassess their loyalty. And old documents suddenly resurface. Discovery doesn't happen in a vacuum. It sends a signal to the world. Now is the time to look. The window of vulnerability is wide open.
And that's the immense danger for Donald Trump. The lawsuit acts as a beacon, reigniting interest in all these other controversies.
Machiavelli teaches that rulers don't fall from a single blow, but from accumulated fractures. This accidental activation of the legal system provides the precise mechanism for those old fractures, the Epstein files, the immigration narrative, past business dealings, to be reopened and forensically examined under the compulsion of the court.
So can you give us a final, blunt summary of the strategic failures here for our listener?
Certainly. This whole thing is a blueprint for how power driven by emotion undermines itself. The blunders are fourfold. First, they confused intimidation with authority. Second, they fatally underestimated their informed opponent Michael Wolff and his archival power. Third, they provoked a system, the court, that they could not dominate. And fourth, through this careless action, Melania Trump inadvertently exposed her primary ally Donald Trump to incredibly high-risk legal scrutiny.
The ultimate takeaway here, the crucial shift in control.
The central point, if you remove questions of guilt or innocence, is control. And control over the narrative, the pace of disclosure, and the scope of the inquiry has fundamentally, and I think irreversibly, shifted away from the Trumps. It's now in the hands of Michael Wolff and the unfeeling legal machine he turned on.
This deep dive really illustrates the profound danger of challenging a knowledgeable insider like Michael Wolff without absolute commitment. And it shows the uncontrollable, impartial power of legal discovery to force transparency, regardless of your political status.
We can leave you with the most dangerous insight Machiavelli offered, a truth that just echoes through history. Rulers are not destroyed by enemies shouting outside the gates. They are destroyed by whispers echoing inside their own halls. Whispers that are now being demanded as sworn testimony by the court system. The internal truth becomes the external weapon.
So we've established that power cannot bully systems and that activating discovery against Michael Wolff was a huge strategic error. Building on that, we want to leave you, our listener, with a final provocative question to think about.
Given the irreversible nature of discovery, what is the single greatest risk now faced by Donald Trump? The specific danger of the past waiting in the hallway that we haven't explicitly mentioned. Something that is guaranteed to surface once that legal principle takes hold. Once power invites exposure, it cannot decide what comes to light." Unquote. Think about the leverage opponents gain from compelling the revelation of, say, financial or private communications related to his time running the family business, things far removed from politics, just because they might be deemed relevant to the state of mind of his legal team during that initial threat.
Think about that until our next deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.